She was abandoned at the altar at 20 years old, crying in front of everyone. But when the millionaire stood up, no one expected what he was about to do. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because the ending will leave you speechless. The scent of magnolias floated in the air like a sacred promise, permeating every corner of that small historic church nestled in the heart of Savannah. The rays of Georgia sun filtered through the century-old stained glass windows, projecting figures of golden and crimson light upon the dark wooden pews where 200 guests waited with expectant smiles. The organ whispered an ancient melody. The kind grandmothers hummed while embroidering tablecloths for their granddaughters' hope chests. Lucy Grace Montgomery walked down the red carpet with measured steps, each one resonating like the beat of a heart in love. She had just turned 20, and between her trembling hands, she held a bouquet of white roses that her grandmother had personally chosen from the family home's garden, cutting them at dawn when the dew still kissed their petals. The wedding dress, inherited from her mother and adjusted by the wrinkled but expert hands of Miss Grace, cascaded in waves of antique lace that whispered secrets with every movement. Through the antique tulle veil, her honey-colored eyes shone with the intensity of someone who believes she is living the most perfect moment of her existence. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, in her temples, in that exact spot in her chest where her heart threatened to escape from pure happiness. The town's ladies watched her, with that mixture of tenderness and nostalgia they reserved for young brides, perhaps remembering their own days of illusion. But when she reached the altar, and her eyes searched for Paul's, the man who had promised to love her until death parted them, she found something that froze the blood in her veins. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes, those dark eyes that had sworn eternal love so many times under the Georgia moon, were fixed on the marble floor worn by centuries of ceremonies. "I can't do this," he murmured, so low that only she could hear. The words fell like stones into a bottomless well. Lucy felt the world stop, the organ go silent, though it kept playing, the faces of the guests blur into a smudged stain of colors and shapes without meaning. "What?" Her voice came out like a silk thread about to break. Paul finally raised his gaze, and in his eyes she saw something she had never noticed before. Cowardice. A deep and rooted cowardice that he had disguised as charm during their 2 years of courtship. "I'm sorry, Lucy, I thought I could, but I can't." And then, before 200 pairs of eyes that went from confusion to horror, Paul Mitchell turned around and walked toward the church door with steps that echoed like sentences. The murmur began like a wave, growing, expanding, until it became a muffled roar that filled every sacred space. Lucy stood motionless. The bouquet of white roses trembled in her hands like a wounded bird. The lace veil, the one her great-grandmother had worn at her own wedding almost a century ago, weighed upon her head as if it were made of lead. Tears began to flow without permission, tracing bright paths down her flushed cheeks, falling upon the white petals that now seemed to wilt before her eyes. The silence that followed was more deafening than any scream, more cruel than any insult, more devastating than any blow. Miss Grace, seated in the front row in her Sunday black dress with the crystal bead rosary between her fingers, tried to stand, but her 78-year-old legs didn't respond with the speed her heart demanded. Lucy's friends, those girls she had grown up with between doll games and teenage secrets, looked at each other not knowing what to do, paralyzed by the magnitude of the humiliation they were witnessing. It was then that something unexpected happened. From the last pew of the church, where the shadow was denser and the air cooler, a man stood up. No one knew him in that town. No one remembered seeing him before on the cobblestone streets, in the historic squares, in the cafes where tourists gathered to enjoy sweet tea and pralines. He was a gentleman, with elegantly styled grey hair, a face marked by lines that spoke of experiences lived, and an impeccable Italian-cut suit that clashed with the simplicity of the place. He walked down the central aisle with firm and measured steps, like someone accustomed to spaces opening at his passage. His polished leather shoes echoed on the marble with a cadence that seemed to impose order on chaos. The murmurs gradually quieted as he advanced, as if his presence commanded instinctive respect. When he reached the altar, he stopped before Lucy. His eyes, a deep grey like the sky before a storm, looked at her with a mixture of compassion and admiration that she didn't understand at that moment. With an elegant movement, he took a silk handkerchief from his jacket pocket and extended it to her. "A woman who has the courage to love like this," he said with a serene voice, clear without a trace of condescension, "deserves to be treated with dignity." Lucy took the handkerchief with trembling fingers. It was soft, embroidered with initials she didn't recognize, AWR. The scent it gave off was subtle, a mixture of sandalwood and something that evoked old libraries and nights by the fireplace. "Thank you," she whispered, though the word was lost among contained sobs. The stranger nodded slightly and then did something no one expected. He removed his suit jacket and placed it over Lucy's shoulders, like a knight from other eras protecting a lady from the elements. But it wasn't from the cold he was protecting her, but from the stares, from the whispers, from the shame that threatened to devour her. "Allow me to accompany you outside," he said, offering her his arm. And Lucy, without knowing why, accepted. Because in that moment of absolute devastation, that stranger was the only thing that seemed solid in a world crumbling around her. They walked together down the aisle, she leaning on his arm like a castaway on a piece of driftwood, he keeping his gaze forward with an expression that challenged anyone to utter a single word. And no one did, not the ladies whispering behind their fans, not the men shifting uncomfortably in their seats, not even Father Benjamin, who watched the scene from the altar with the expression of someone who has seen too much in this life to be surprised by anything anymore. When they crossed the church threshold and the August sun hit them with its merciless intensity, Lucy stopped. She breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the hot air that smelled of jasmine and dry earth. And then, for the first time since Paul had uttered those fateful words, she spoke clearly. "Who are you?" The man smiled slightly, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes but conveyed genuine warmth. "My name is Anthony Warren Richardson, and I'm here completely by chance." "Chance doesn't exist," she murmured, repeating a phrase her grandmother often said. "Perhaps you're right," he replied, looking toward the oak trees draped with Spanish moss that surrounded Savannah, those ancient sentinels that seemed to guard eternal secrets. "Perhaps destiny has very strange ways of presenting itself." At that moment, Miss Grace appeared at the church door, supported by two neighbors helping her walk. Her eyes, the same honey color as her granddaughter's, evaluated the stranger with that penetrating gaze that only southern grandmothers possess. "You," she said, pointing at him with a trembling but firm finger. "I don't know who you are, but I owe you my granddaughter's dignity." Anthony Warren inclined his head with respect. "You owe me nothing, ma'am. Any decent person would have done the same." But both knew that wasn't true. 200 people had witnessed the humiliation, and only one had had the courage to act. The sun kept shining over Savannah as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't just changed irrevocably for a 20-year-old young woman who had entered a church as a bride and left as something completely different. A woman who was beginning to discover, though she didn't know it yet, that sometimes the most painful endings are simply beginnings in disguise. The 3 days that followed the disaster at the church were the longest Lucy had ever lived. Savannah was a small town, one of those where everyone knew everyone's secrets, and where news traveled faster than the wind from the coast. By sunset on the same day as the failed wedding, there wasn't a single house where the incident wasn't being discussed. Women whispered while hanging laundry in their backyards, men shook their heads in the local bars, and children repeated fragments of conversations they didn't fully understand. Lucy locked herself in her room, that small space with whitewashed walls and a window overlooking the courtyard where her grandmother had been growing red geraniums for decades. She didn't want to eat, didn't want to talk, didn't want to exist. She just remained curled up in the bed that had been hers since childhood, hugging the pillow that still held traces of the perfume she had put on for the wedding, that jasmine scent that now made her nauseous. Miss Grace came up every few hours with trays that returned untouched to the kitchen, soups that grew cold, biscuits that hardened, peaches that no one peeled. The elderly woman didn't insist with words. She simply left the food by the bed and planted a kiss on her granddaughter's forehead before retreating, shuffling her feet across the wooden floor. On the third day, when the sun was beginning to set and the sky was tinted with those orange and violet tones that only the Georgia coast knew how to produce, Someone knocked at the house's door. Miss Grace opened it to find Anthony Warren, the stranger from the church. He was now dressed more casually, in light linen pants and a white shirt rolled up to his elbows, but he still emanated that aura of distinction that seemed to be part of his nature. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he greeted with a slight bow. "I've come to return this." In his hands, he held the jacket he had lent to Lucy, perfectly folded. "Come in," said the elderly woman, stepping aside. "And don't call me ma'am, it makes me feel older than I already am. I'm Grace." Anthony smiled, a smile that softened the lines of his face and made him look younger. "Anthony," he replied, "though something tells me you already know that." Miss Grace nodded as she guided him to the kitchen, the heart of that century-old house. "In this town there are no secrets, Mr. Anthony. I already know you're a businessman from New York, that you were traveling to Atlanta when your car took the wrong road, and that you stayed at the only inn in town because the heat prevented you from continuing." "I see the local information system is quite efficient," he commented, sitting in the wooden chair the elderly woman indicated. More efficient than any newspaper, she placed a cup of coffee in front of him without asking if he wanted it. "What I don't know is why you're still here." Anthony took the cup and sipped, taking a moment before responding. "I don't know for certain either, Grace. I should have continued my journey 3 days ago, but something holds me here. Something or someone." The man's grey eyes met the elderly woman's. There was a raw honesty in them that she knew how to appreciate. "It's not what you think. I have no romantic interest in your granddaughter, if that's what concerns you. But the scene I witnessed," he paused, searching for the right words, "reminded me of someone who was also abandoned many years ago." "Your wife?" Anthony shook his head. "My wife was the one who left. Me. 5 years ago. She went to live in another country with another man without explanations, without goodbyes. One day, I simply found a letter on the dining room table and an empty closet." Miss Grace remained silent for a long moment. Outside, the song of crickets began to fill the air of the approaching night. "Then you understand the pain," she finally said. "I understand it all too well." The elderly woman rose with effort and walked to the window overlooking the inner courtyard. The geraniums glowed like drops of blood under the last light of day. "My Lucy isn't just my granddaughter. She's my daughter in everything that matters. Her parents died in an accident when she was 6, and since then it's just been the two of us against the world. I've watched her grow, suffer, smile, dream, and I've never seen her like this. So broken. May I speak with her?" "You can try. She hasn't left her room since we got back from the church." Anthony nodded and stood up. "Take this." Grace handed him a tray with a bowl of chicken soup and a piece of cornbread. "If you can't get her to eat, no one will." He climbed the worn stone stairs, each step creaking under his weight. Lucy's bedroom door was ajar, and through the crack he could see the silhouette of a young woman huddled by the window, looking outside without really seeing anything. He knocked softly with his knuckles. "Lucy, it's Anthony, the man from the church. May I come in?" There was no response, but no rejection either. He interpreted the silence as permission and pushed the door open carefully. The room was small but cozy, with walls covered in old photographs and shelves full of books worn by multiple readings. On a chair rested the wedding dress, still not put away, like a ghost of silk and lace that refused to disappear. "I brought you something to eat," he said, placing the tray on the nightstand. Lucy slowly turned her head. Her eyes, reddened and swollen, looked at him with a mixture of confusion and something resembling gratitude. "Why are you here?" Her voice sounded hoarse, rusted by days of crying and silence. "Because sometimes, when we're at the bottom of the well, we need someone to remind us that there's a ladder to climb out." "I don't want to climb out." Anthony sat on the edge of the bed, maintaining a respectful distance. "I know. Right now the pain is so great that it seems impossible to imagine a moment when it won't be there. But I promise you something. That moment will come." "How can you know?" "Because I was where you are now. 5 years ago, my wife left me. 22 years of marriage, a son, an entire life built together. And overnight it all disappeared. For months I thought the pain would consume me, that there was no reason to get up every morning." Lucy was watching him attentively now, recognizing in his words an echo of her own suffering. And what happened? One day I woke up and realized I was still breathing, that my heart was still beating, even though I was convinced it had broken. And I understood something important. Surviving isn't an act of will, it's simply what we do. What makes us human? But I don't want to just survive. Tears began to flow from her eyes again. I wanted to live. I wanted to love and be loved. I wanted to build a family, have children, grow old with someone who looked at me like I was the most important thing in the world. And all of that is still possible, Lucy. The fact that Paul wasn't the right person doesn't mean that person doesn't exist. He promised me. Her voice broke. He promised me so many things. Promises are only worth as much as the person who makes them, and he showed he's worth nothing. Lucy was silent for a moment, processing those words. Then, almost without thinking, she reached for the tray and picked up the bowl of soup. The first sip was like waking from a dark dream. The comforting taste of chicken, the touch of homemade seasoning, the broth sliding down her parched throat. "It's good," she murmured. "Your grandmother has magic in her hands." For the first time in 3 days, something resembling a smile appeared on Lucy's lips. "That's true." Anthony stood up, understanding he had accomplished what he came to do. "Tomorrow I'll come again, if you'll allow me. I'd like to see that bakery I've heard so much about in town." "The bakery?" "The one with the most famous pecan pies in the region. They told me you make them." Lucy lowered her gaze to the bowl she held in her hands. "I used to make them. I don't know if I'll ever make them again." "I think you will," said Anthony from the doorway. "Because there's something in you that doesn't break easily. I saw it in your eyes when we walked out of the church together, a strength that even you don't know yet." And with those words, he went downstairs, leaving Lucy with the soup bowl in her hands and a question echoing in her mind. Could that stranger possibly be right? A week after the disaster, reality struck with the force of a hammer. Lucy sat in the kitchen of the family home, surrounded by papers covering every inch of the wooden table. Bills, receipts, loan contracts. Each document was a reminder of what it had cost to organize that wedding that never happened. "Grandma," her voice trembled as she added up numbers on a piece of paper, "how much money did we borrow exactly?" Miss Grace, who was stirring a pot of gumbo on the stove, didn't turn around. "Don't worry about that now, sweetheart." "Grandma, I need to know." The silence that followed was answer enough. The elderly woman finally set down the wooden spoon and sat across from her granddaughter, her wrinkled hands covering hers. "We borrowed the equivalent of 3 years of the bakery's profits." Lucy felt the air leave her lungs. 3 years? The dress, the flowers, the catering, the church, the musicians. Grace enumerated each thing with a tired voice. "We wanted you to have the perfect day. We wanted it to be like the ones in the magazines. But we didn't have that money. No, we borrowed it from Mr. Ferguson at the general store. He was always a friend of your grandfather's, God rest his soul. He gave us a good rate on the interest. But even so, we're ruined." The word hung in the kitchen air, heavy as a tombstone. Lucy stood abruptly, walking to the window overlooking the main street. She could see the neighbors coming and going with their shopping bags, children playing in the square's fountain, life continuing as if nothing had happened, and meanwhile, her world was crumbling. "I'll sell the dress," she said suddenly, "and the shoes, and everything that can be sold. That won't be enough. Then I'll work double shifts at the bakery, triple if necessary." "Sweetheart, the bakery barely covers the month's expenses. How are we going to—" The sound of someone knocking at the door interrupted the conversation. Lucy went to open it and found Anthony Warren, who was holding a paper bag from the local bakery. "Good morning," he greeted with a smile. "I bring peach muffins. They told me they're the best in the region after yours, of course." Lucy looked at him with a confused expression. "What are you doing here?" "I came to invite you both for breakfast, but I see it's not a good time." "No, it's not." Anthony looked over Lucy's shoulder at the mess of papers on the table, and his expression turned serious. "Financial problems? It's none of your business." "Lucy," Miss Grace's voice came from the kitchen, "don't be rude. Let the gentleman in." With a sigh of resignation, Lucy stepped aside. Anthony entered and placed the bag of muffins on a chair before approaching the table. His eyes scanned the documents with the expert gaze of someone accustomed to reading numbers and contracts. "The wedding," he said, not as a question but as a statement. "Yes." "How much?" Lucy crossed her arms over her chest. "I already told you it's not." $60,000, Miss Grace interrupted, entering the room with 3 cups of coffee. "Plus interest," Anthony nodded slowly. "Allow me to help you." "No." Lucy's response was immediate, categorical, with no room for negotiation. "Why not?" he asked calmly. "Because I don't need charity. Because I don't know you. Because I don't want to owe anyone anything." "Lucy!" Her grandmother tried to intervene. "No, Grandma, I've suffered enough humiliation this week. I'm not going to accept money from a stranger like I'm some beggar." Anthony observed her for a long moment. In his eyes there was no offense or irritation, only deep understanding. "I understand your pride," he finally said. "I respect it even. But let me make you a different proposal." "I don't want any proposal." "At least hear it." Lucy remained silent, and he took that as permission to continue. "I've tried your pastries, the ones your grandmother served me yesterday morning. They're extraordinary. They have something I haven't found in any bakery in New York, Chicago, or any other city I've visited. So what? So I have contacts in the food industry, distributors, restaurateurs, people who are always looking for authentic products. If you'd allow me to invest in your bakery, not as charity but as business, we could expand production and sales. You'd pay off the wedding debt with the profits, and I'd get a return on my investment." Lucy exchanged a glance with her grandmother. The proposal was unexpected, and something in the way Anthony presented it, as a deal between equals, was beginning to weaken her defenses. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice less hostile now. "Why would you invest in a small-town bakery when you could invest in any business in the city?" Anthony took one of the coffee cups and sipped before responding. "Because money stopped meaning anything to me a long time ago. I have more than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. What I don't have is," he searched for the right word, "purpose, something that makes me feel like I'm contributing to something real. And helping 2 strangers would give you purpose. Helping someone get back up after a fall always gives purpose." Silence extended in the kitchen. The wall clock, the one that had belonged to Lucy's grandfather, marked the seconds with its constant tick-tock. Outside, a flock of birds flew south, their silhouettes cutting against the blue sky. It was Miss Grace who spoke first. "We accept." "Grandma," Lucy protested. "We accept," the elderly woman repeated firmly. "With conditions. You invest, we work. Everything in writing, legal and transparent. And when the debt is paid, everyone goes their own way." Anthony nodded. "That seems fair." "And one more thing," Grace added, fixing her eyes on his. "If at any moment I discover your intentions aren't honorable, I swear by the memory of my late husband that I'll chase you to the ends of the earth with this cast-iron skillet." For the first time, Anthony let out a genuine laugh. "Duly noted, Miss Grace." And so on that August morning, between cups of coffee and peach muffins, an agreement was sealed that would change the destiny of everyone involved. Lucy, however, remained silent. She had accepted the help, but something inside her kept resisting. Something that whispered that depending on others was the first step toward disappointment. That trusting was the prelude to pain. She didn't know yet how much she would have to unlearn before she could live again. September arrived in Savannah, painting the leaves of the oaks with golden and ochre tones. The Montgomery family bakery had undergone remarkable changes in the last month. The display cases now showed not only the traditional pecan pies, but a variety of new creations Lucy had begun to develop. Pralines dipped in Belgian chocolate, gourmet red velvet cupcakes, peach cobblers with homemade vanilla ice cream. Anthony had kept his word. The contacts he had promised turned out to be real. Distributors from Atlanta, Charleston, and New Orleans who began placing regular orders. An article in a regional food magazine had highlighted the authentic flavors of a small southern bakery, attracting curious visitors who arrived ready to try those delicacies everyone was talking about. Lucy worked tirelessly. She got up at 4 in the morning to prepare the doughs, supervised every detail of production, and didn't retire until past 10 at night. Work was her refuge, her way of keeping at bay thoughts about Paul, about the wedding, about everything she had lost. But the past has cruel ways of catching up with us. It was a Thursday afternoon when he appeared. Lucy was behind the counter, wrapping a box of pralines for a customer, when the door's bell rang, and she felt before she saw that something had changed in the air. Paul Mitchell stood in the doorway. He was holding a bouquet of red roses that seemed to bleed against the sunset light, streaming through the windows. He wore the same leather jacket he had worn the first time he had asked her out, almost 3 years ago. "Lucy," he said, his voice heavy with an emotion she couldn't interpret. The customer looked alternately at one and the other, sensing the tension in the air. Lucy handed her the box with hands that weren't trembling, though it took a titanic effort to keep them steady. "Thank you for your purchase, Mrs. Collins." The woman took the box and practically ran out, eager to get away from the volcano about to erupt. When the door closed, Lucy and Paul were alone. The scent of roses mixed with the smell of caramelized sugar and vanilla that permeated every corner of the place. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice flat as the surface of a frozen lake. "I needed to see you. To explain." "Explain? After a month?" Paul took a few steps forward, leaving the roses on the counter. "I couldn't find the words. I didn't know how to." "How to what?" "How to justify leaving me standing in front of 200 people. How to explain that you destroyed my dignity, my reputation, my finances. I know what I did was horrible." "No." Lucy went around the counter, approaching him with steps that echoed on the tile floor. "Horrible doesn't even come close to describing what you did." Paul lowered his gaze. "I was scared, Lucy. I wasn't ready for commitment. The idea of spending the rest of my life tied to one person terrified me. You should have thought about that before you proposed, before my grandmother and I went into debt up to our necks to pay for the wedding you wanted. I know, and that's why I'm here. I've changed, Lucy. This month without you has made me realize how much you mean to me." Lucy let out a bitter laugh that contained not a gram of humor. "How convenient. You change right when you find out the bakery is growing, right when rumors are spreading about the millionaire investor from New York." Paul's eyes hardened for an instant, barely perceptible, but Lucy caught it. She had always been observant, though during their relationship she had chosen to ignore the signs that now revealed themselves with crystal clarity. "That has nothing to do with it," he protested. "No? Then tell me, Paul, what have you been doing this month? Where have you been?" "At my parents' house in Charleston, thinking." "And what conclusions did you reach from all that thinking?" Paul extended his hands toward her. "That I made the worst mistake of my life, that I love you, that I want to try again." Lucy took a step back, putting distance between them. "No. Lucy, please, I said no. Give me a chance to show you." "Show me what?" Her voice rose, years of contained doubts finally finding release. "Show me that I can trust you, that the next time you promise me something you won't run away like a coward." "I'm not a coward. A man who abandons his fiancée at the altar because he's afraid of commitment is exactly that, a coward." The words struck like slaps. Paul stepped back, his face transforming. The mask of repentance began to crack, revealing something darker beneath. Resentment, wounded pride, the indignation of someone not accustomed to being told no. "You've changed," he said, his tone becoming accusatory. "You never used to talk to me like this. Before I was an idiot who believed everything you said. And what are you now? The millionaire's pet." The silence that followed was dense as lead. Lucy felt something break inside her, but it wasn't her heart. It was the last fiber of doubt that remained, that small part of herself that still wondered if she had done something wrong, if somehow she had deserved to be abandoned. "Leave." Her voice was firm now, as solid as the stones of the old fort. "And never come back." "Lucy, son, I said leave." Paul picked up the bouquet of roses that had been ignored on the counter. In his eyes burned a mixture of humiliation and rage. "You'll regret this." "I doubt it very much." The door's bell rang as he left, a cheerful sound that contrasted absurdly with the tension of the moment. Through the glass, Lucy watched him walk away down the cobblestone street, his figure becoming smaller until it disappeared around a corner. Then, and only then, did she allow her legs to give way. She let herself fall into the chair behind the counter, breathing deeply, feeling something release in her chest. It wasn't exactly joy. It was something harder to name, a sense of closure, of a door finally closing on a chapter that should have ended long ago. When Miss Grace came in through the back door minutes later, she found her granddaughter looking out the window with an expression she hadn't seen in weeks. "What happened?" the elderly woman asked. Lucy turned to her. "Paul was here." And I realized something important, Grandma." "What, sweetheart?" Lucy smiled, a small but genuine smile. "That I've spent too long confusing the fear of being alone with love." Miss Grace crossed the distance between them and hugged her granddaughter tightly. "That, my dear, is the first step to finding true love." October brought with it rains that washed Savannah's streets, and a discovery that would shake the foundations of the fragile peace Lucy had begun to build. It all started with a routine visit from Anthony to the bakery. He had adopted the habit of stopping by every Tuesday and Friday afternoon, reviewing the account books with Lucy, while Miss Grace served them hot chocolate and freshly baked cookies. That Tuesday, however, the atmosphere was different. Lucy had noticed a change in the attitude of several neighbors, gazes that turned away, conversations that abruptly interrupted when she appeared, whispers that faded as she passed. "Have you noticed anything strange lately?" she asked Anthony while he reviewed last month's figures. "Strange in what sense?" "The people. They're acting strangely around me." Anthony set down the papers on the table and looked at her with a serious expression. "Maybe you should sit down." The tone of his voice made something tighten in Lucy's stomach. "What's going on?" "I hired someone to investigate Paul's background." "What? Why?" "Because something didn't add up. The way he left you, so sudden, so cowardly. And then his attempt to come back, just when the business was starting to do well." Lucy felt the ground move beneath her feet. "What did you find out?" Anthony took an envelope from his briefcase and placed it on the table. "Paul has debts, many of them. Gambling debts, mainly. He was engaged to you because he thought your grandmother had money saved up. When he discovered that wasn't the case, that in fact you were in debt because of the wedding, he ran. And now he's back because he thinks my investment has turned you into someone with resources." Lucy took the envelope but didn't open it. She held it in her hands as if it burned. "All this time," her voice broke, "all this time he was with me for money." "I'm sorry, Lucy." She stood abruptly, moving away from the table, from the papers, from that truth that threatened to drown her. "And the people in town know this?" Anthony nodded. "Apparently some knew from the beginning. Paul's debts were known in certain circles, and no one told me anything." "They probably didn't want to hurt you," Lucy let out a bitter laugh, "but they did let me be publicly humiliated. People don't always make the right decisions, especially when it comes to delivering bad news." Silence extended between them, dense and heavy. The rain beat against the window panes with a constant, hypnotic rhythm. Finally, Lucy spoke. "Why did you do this? Why investigate him?" Anthony took a while to respond. "Because I care about you." The 3 words hung suspended in the air. "You barely know me," she said. "I know enough. I know you're an extraordinary woman who has been mistreated by life and by the people who should have protected her. I know you have a strength you don't even suspect, and I know you deserve to know the truth, however painful it may be." Lucy turned to the window, watching the raindrops slide down the glass. "I should be more devastated than I am." "And how are you?" "Relieved, I think. Like I finally understand something that didn't make sense. Sometimes the truth hurts less than uncertainty." She turned to look at him. "Why are you still here, Mr. Anthony? It's been almost 3 months. Surely you have business to attend to in New York, a life to return to." Anthony leaned back in his chair, and for the first time, Lucy saw vulnerability in his eyes. "Do you want the truth?" "Always. I have nothing to return to. I have a company that practically runs itself, an empty apartment where only silence awaits me, and a son who prefers not to speak to me." "A son?" "James, he's 30, lives in Los Angeles, works at a financial consulting firm, and he blames me for his mother's divorce." Was it your fault? No, but that's hard to explain to someone who adored his mother and doesn't want to hear another version of the story. Lucy returned to the table and sat across from him. Tell me, why do you want to know? Because you know all my secrets. It's only fair that I know some of yours. Anthony looked at her for a long moment. Then, with a sigh that seemed to release years of accumulated weight, he began to speak. He told her about Helen, his wife of 22 years, about how they had met in college, about the love he believed eternal, about the years of apparent happiness. He told her about the suspicions he began to have when she started traveling alone, to visit friends, about the phone calls she would cut off when he entered the room, about the distance growing between them like an invisible wall. He told her about the day he found the letter, a brief farewell, almost impersonal, where Helen explained she had found something more with an Italian artist she had met at a gallery in Manhattan. There were no apologies, no elaborate explanations, just a statement of fact. She was leaving and wouldn't return. And James? Lucy asked. James was 25 then, already an adult, but he still saw his mother as the perfect mother. When she left, he needed someone to blame, and I was the easiest target. That's not fair. No, but life rarely is. The chocolate had grown cold between them, forgotten. Outside, the rain was beginning to ease, and a ray of sun was filtering timidly through the clouds. Thank you, said Lucy, for telling me. Thank you for listening. She extended her hand and placed it on his. A simple gesture, but laden with meaning. I think we've both been hurt by people who should have loved us better. Yes, but perhaps that makes us capable of recognizing the authentic when we find it. Their gazes met, and something changed in the air. It wasn't love yet, not that kind. It was something prior, more fundamental, recognition. Two wounded souls finding each other in the middle of a storm. The back door opened and Miss Grace entered with a tray of fresh cookies. Am I interrupting something? She asked with a smile that suggested she knew exactly what she was interrupting. No, Grandma. Lucy withdrew her hand and took a cookie. We were just talking. Right, well, keep talking. She left the tray on the table. I have to go pray the rosary with the neighbors. I'll be back late. And with an almost imperceptible wink at Anthony, she left the way she came. Winter arrived in Georgia with a deceptive softness. The days were cool but sunny, and the nights brought a dry cold that penetrated to the bones. The bakery continued to prosper. Orders increased each week, and Lucy had hired 2 helpers from town to keep up with the demand. But happiness never comes without its counterweight. One November morning, Miss Grace didn't come down for breakfast. Lucy, puzzled by her grandmother's absence since she was always the first to rise, went up to her room and found her lying in bed, pale as the whitewashed walls with labored breathing. Grandma, she rushed to her, touching her burning forehead. What's wrong? It's nothing. Sweetheart, Grace's voice was barely a whisper. I just need to rest a little. But Lucy knew it was more than that. She called the town doctor, who after examining her diagnosed pneumonia that required immediate hospitalization. The following hours were a whirlwind of ambulances, hospital corridors, and doctors speaking with grave expressions. Lucy didn't leave her grandmother's bedside for a moment, holding her wrinkled hand while machines beeped and nurses came and went with mechanical regularity. It was there that Anthony found her, late at night, when the hospital fell silent and visitors went home to their houses. Lucy. She raised her gaze. Her eyes were reddened, her hair disheveled. And she had an air of defeat Anthony had never seen in her. You shouldn't be here, she murmured. Visiting hours ended hours ago. I convinced the night nurse that I was a distant relative. And how did you manage that? I have my ways. Despite everything, Lucy sketched a weak smile. Anthony pulled up a chair and sat beside her. How is she? The doctors say it's serious. At her age, any infection is dangerous. Tears began to fall without her being able to stop them. I can't lose her. She's all I have left. Anthony took her hand in his. You won't lose her. You can't promise me that. No, but I can promise you I'll be here, whatever happens. They stayed like that for hours in silence, while the night advanced and the outside world sank into stillness. Miss Grace slept under the effect of medications. her breathing more regular now, less labored. Near dawn, when the first rays of light began to tinge the sky pale pink, Lucy spoke. "Why are you doing this?" "This? Staying, helping, caring about what happens to us." Anthony took a while to respond. When he did, his words were carefully chosen. "There's something I haven't told you." Lucy looked at him with an inquiring expression. "Last week, when I came to review the accounts, I noticed your grandmother seemed more tired than usual. She was coughing frequently, though she tried to hide it. I asked if she was okay, and she told me it was nothing, just the change of season." "That sounds like her." "Yes, but I wasn't at ease. So I did something without consulting you." Lucy felt something tighten inside her. "What did you do?" "I hired a nurse, a professional from Atlanta who arrived 3 days ago. I introduced her to your grandmother as a friend who needed work, and she hired her to help with household chores." "What?" "I wanted someone to watch over her closely, someone who could detect any health problem in time." Lucy released his hand and stood up. "Are you telling me you put someone in my house without telling me?" "Lucy, no." Her voice rose, waking a patient in the adjacent room. "Who gave you the right to make decisions about my family behind my back?" "I just wanted to help." "That's not helping, that's controlling." Anthony also stood, keeping his voice low despite the tension. "You're right. I should have told you. But I thought you'd refuse." "Of course I would have refused, because I don't need anyone watching over my grandmother, as if we were incapable of taking care of ourselves. That's not what—" "No," Lucy raised a hand. "I don't want to hear any more. I appreciate everything you've done, I really do, but there are limits and you've crossed them." The silence that followed was dense as winter fog. Anthony nodded slowly. "I understand. I'll leave." He turned toward the door, but before leaving, he spoke one last time. "The nurse's name is Claire. She was the one who noticed the symptoms and called the doctor in time. If she hadn't been there—" He left the sentence incomplete. "I just wanted you to know." And with that, he left. Lucy stood in the middle of the room, trembling with anger, and something else she didn't want to name. She looked at her grandmother asleep, so fragile under the hospital's white sheets, and the weight of Anthony's words fell on her like a stone. If the nurse hadn't been there, how long would she have taken to notice the symptoms? Would she have arrived in time? She let herself fall back into the chair, burying her face in her hands. Pride is a sweet poison, her grandmother used to say, and Lucy was beginning to understand exactly what that meant. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks in which Miss Grace slowly recovered in the hospital, gaining strength day by day thanks to antibiotics and constant care. 3 weeks in which Lucy divided her time between the bakery and her grandmother's bedside. 3 weeks in which she didn't see Anthony Warren once. The investment money kept arriving punctually in the business account, but the man behind the agreement had vanished like smoke in the wind. He didn't answer calls, didn't visit the town, and when Lucy asked at the inn where he had been staying, they told her he had returned to New York. "You should call him," Miss Grace said one afternoon from her hospital bed. Lucy, who was peeling an orange by the window, pretended not to hear. "Don't play deaf. I know you can hear me." "I have nothing to say to him." "You have plenty to say to him, starting with an apology." Lucy turned to her grandmother. "An apology? He was the one who acted behind my back. He was the one who probably saved my life." The words hung in the air, undeniable. "That doesn't justify," Lucy began. "Sweetheart," Grace interrupted with that voice that admitted no reply. "Listen to me well. That man has done more for us in 4 months than most people would do in an entire lifetime. And you push him out of your life because he didn't consult you before protecting us. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. Your pride blinds you." Lucy left the orange on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed. "I'm scared, Grandma." "Of what?" "Of depending on someone, of trusting and being destroyed again." Miss Grace took her granddaughter's hand in hers. "Fear is natural after what you went through, but you can't let it control your life. Paul was a coward and a liar, but Anthony is different." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've lived many years, sweetheart, and I've learned to recognize people by their actions, not their words. Anthony could have continued on his way the day of the wedding. He could have ignored a stranger crying at an altar, but he didn't. And everything he's done since then, every gesture, every decision, speaks of a good man. Lucy remained silent, her grandmother's words resonating in her depths. "Go find him," Grace said, "before it's too late." "I don't know where he is." "New York. Go to New York." "And the bakery?" "And you." "The bakery can survive a few days without you, and I'll be fine. Claire is here with me." Lucy smiled despite herself, the mysterious nurse, who turns out to be a lovely woman with excellent chicken soup. That night, Lucy took a flight to New York. She traveled for hours, watching the Georgia landscape give way to the eastern coastline, the sleeping towns where only church lights shone. She arrived in New York at dawn. The city received her with its characteristic bustle, cars honking, people running toward the subway, the smell of coffee and fresh bagels from the delis opening their doors. She had Anthony's address. She had found it in the investment contract documents kept in a drawer at the bakery, a building on the Upper East Side, one of the most exclusive areas of the city. When she arrived at the entrance, the magnificence of the place intimidated her. It was a stone building with wrought iron balconies, a uniformed doorman, and an elegance that spoke of fortunes inherited over generations. "Who are you looking for?" the doorman asked with professional courtesy. "Mr. Anthony Warren Richardson." "Is he expecting you?" "No." The doorman evaluated her with his gaze, noting her simple clothes, her small suitcase, her appearance of a tired traveler. "Wait a moment." He picked up the intercom and spoke in a low voice. Lucy caught fragments. "A young woman says she's from Savannah. Should I send her up?" When he hung up, his expression had changed subtly. "8th floor. The elevator is on the right." The elevator took her to a floor where there were only 2 doors. Before she could knock, one of them opened. Anthony was there. He was dressed casually, in cotton pants and a grey wool sweater. He looked like he hadn't slept well, with pronounced dark circles and several days' stubble. "Lucy, I came to apologize." The words came out before she could think them, direct and bare. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do. I overreacted. You acted with good intentions, and I yelled at you like you were a criminal." Anthony observed her for a long moment. "Would you like to come in?" The apartment was exactly what she had imagined, and at the same time completely different. Spacious, yes, with high ceilings and large windows overlooking a park, but also cold, impersonal, without family photographs or objects suggesting affection or memories. It was the home of someone who had stopped trying to make it a welcoming place. "Coffee?" he offered. "Please." While he prepared the coffee in a kitchen that looked like it was out of a design magazine, Lucy approached the window. The city extended below, a sea of buildings and avenues that pulsed with its own life. "I'm sorry," Anthony said, approaching with 2 steaming cups. "I should have consulted you before hiring Claire. And I'm sorry for reacting the way I did. My grandmother is right. She probably saved her life." "How is Grace?" "Better, much better. The doctors say she can go home next week." Anthony smiled, and it was like seeing the sun appear from behind clouds. "I'm glad to hear that." They sat on a leather sofa facing the window, the silence between them more comfortable now, less charged with tension. "Why didn't you come back?" Lucy asked. "After that night at the hospital, I mean." "I thought you needed space." "I didn't need space. I needed time to stop being an idiot." Anthony let out a laugh, genuine and warm. "You're not an idiot, Lucy. You're someone who has been hurt and is afraid of being hurt again. That's the same explanation I give myself, but it's no excuse for treating badly the people who care about me. Do you think I care about you?" "I think..." She paused, searching for the right words. "I think you're the most genuinely good man I've ever known, and I think it scares me how much I care about your opinion." Anthony's grey eyes looked at her with an intensity that made her hold her breath. "I'm 25 years older than you," he said. "I could be your father. But you're not." "No, I'm not." The air between them changed, charging with an electricity neither of them expected. "What's happening here?" Lucy whispered. "I don't know, but I think neither of us is ready to find out yet." She nodded, accepting the truth of those words. "Will you come back to Savannah?" she asked. "Do you want me to come back?" "Yes." A simple word containing entire worlds. Anthony set down his coffee cup and leaned forward. "I'll come back." And on that winter morning in New York, while the sun began to warm the city's rooftops, something new began to germinate between two people who had come to believe that love was no longer possible. December brought with it the scent of roasting chestnuts and preparations for the Christmas holidays. Miss Grace had returned home and was recovering satisfactorily, though Claire remained by her side at the insistence of both Anthony and the elderly woman herself, who had developed genuine affection for the nurse. The bakery was in full swing. Orders for pecan pies, pralines, and gingerbread cookies arrived from all over Georgia, and Lucy worked endless shifts to fulfill them all. Anthony had returned to Savannah as he promised, and his presence had become a comforting constant in daily life. But not everything was peace and sweetness. One afternoon, while Lucy was decorating a tray of sugar cookies with candied pecans, the door's bell rang with force. She looked up and found herself facing a young man, about 30 years old, with a furrowed brow and an expression that combined anger and disdain. "Are you Lucy Montgomery?" he asked without preamble. "Yes, how can I help you?" "I'm James Warren, Anthony's son." The name fell like a bucket of cold water. Lucy had heard about James, knew about the fractured relationship between father and son, but she didn't expect this encounter. "Nice to meet you," she responded, wiping her hands on her apron. "Your father has told me about you. I bet he has, and I'm sure it was all wonderful things." The sarcasm was so thick it could be cut with a knife. "Is there a problem?" "The problem is you." James advanced toward the counter, not bothering to lower his voice. "I don't know what trick you've used to hook my father, but I want you to know I don't buy any of this farce." Lucy felt the heat rise to her cheeks. "I don't know what you're talking about." "No? Then let me explain. A young girl appears crying in a church. My father becomes her knight in shining armor, and suddenly he's investing fortunes in a small-town business and traveling constantly to Georgia. Doesn't that seem a bit convenient to you?" "What seems to me is that you're being incredibly rude." "Call it what you want. I call it protecting my family." "Protecting it from what?" "From a baker who works 14 hours a day to run an honest business. From a manipulator who saw an opportunity and is taking advantage of it." The words struck hard. Lucy thought about shouting, defending herself, throwing this man out of her shop. But something stopped her. Something in James's eyes behind the hostility that she recognized all too well. Fear. She took a deep breath. "Mr. Warren, I understand the situation seems strange to you. I understand you see your father acting in ways you don't understand. But I assure you I have no interest in your father's money. That's what they all say." "You know what? You're right." The response surprised James. "What?" "You're right to be suspicious. In your place, I'd probably think the same." Lucy went around the counter and walked to a folder she kept on a shelf next to the cash register. She opened it and extracted a stack of documents. "Here's the entire history of the investment. Every dollar your father put into this business is documented as a loan, not a gift. We've already paid back 40%, and the rest will be paid in the next 2 years as agreed." James took the papers with distrust. "This could be fake." "It could be, but it isn't. And if you want to verify it, you can hire any auditor you choose. I'll give you access to all the account books myself." The young man leafed through the documents, his expression gradually transforming from hostility to confusion. "My father, does he know you're showing me this?" "No." "And I'd prefer you didn't tell him." "Why?" "Because this is between you and me. Your father has been incredibly generous with my family, and the least I can do is show his son that my intentions are honorable." James closed the folder and looked at her with an expression Lucy couldn't interpret. "I've misjudged you." "Not completely." The initial suspicion had logic. What doesn't make sense is maintaining it after seeing the evidence. Silence extended between them. Outside, a family passed by, commenting on the Christmas lights decorating the square. "What do you feel for my father?" James finally asked. The question was direct, without beating around the bush. Respect, gratitude, genuine affection. "Love? Lucy held his gaze. I still don't know what love is, Mr. Warren. I thought I knew once and I was wrong. But I know your father is an exceptional man who deserves to be happy. He says the same thing about you. Does he talk about me? It's practically all he talks about when we see each other. Lucy felt something move in her chest, a warmth spreading like honey being poured. I didn't know. No, I suppose you didn't. James left the documents on the counter. I owe you an apology. Accepted, but I'll be watching you. I'd expect nothing less. A tiny smile, almost imperceptible, appeared on James's lips. I see why my father likes you. And with that he left the shop, leaving Lucy with her heart beating at a rhythm she didn't quite recognize. Almost the Savannah Music Festival arrived with its usual explosion of colors, music, and tradition. Almost 8 months had passed since that failed wedding that had changed the destiny of so many lives, and the town was preparing for a celebration very different from that one. The streets filled with stages decorated with lights, the air was permeated with the aroma of barbecue and sweet tea, and jazz bands played while couples danced under the stars. It was the most important festival of the year, and the entire town participated with contagious enthusiasm. Anthony had returned from New York specifically for the occasion, and James, surprisingly, accompanied him. The relationship between father and son had experienced a cautious thaw since the encounter at the bakery, and though progress was slow, it existed. That afternoon, as the sun began to descend, painting the sky with shades of peach and lavender, Lucy walked among the booths arm in arm with Miss Grace. The elderly woman, fully recovered, wore a floral dress she had worn to festivals decades ago. "Look who's coming," Grace said, indicating with a nod. Anthony and James approached through the crowd. The father wore a white linen shirt that suited him surprisingly well, while the son opted for a casual button-down and jeans that made him look less rigid than usual. "Ladies," Anthony made a small bow that drew a giggle from Grace, "would you grant me the honor of your company?" "The honor is ours, Mr. Anthony." The four walked together among the booths, tasting local food, listening to music, mingling with the collective joy of the town. Lucy noticed the neighbors' glances, the whispers her presence alongside Anthony generated, but for the first time she didn't care. She had learned that rumors were like the wind. They passed without leaving a mark if you didn't give them importance. When night fell and the fireworks began to illuminate the sky over the historic district, Anthony gently drew her away from the group. "Can we talk?" "Of course." He led her to the riverfront overlook, that place where the Savannah River stretched majestically below the ancient oaks, and the stars seemed within arm's reach. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice deeper than usual. Lucy felt her heart quicken. "I'm listening." "These months by your side have been—" He searched for the right words. "The happiest I remember in a long time. For me too. But there's something that worries me." "What?" Anthony turned to face her directly. The light from the fireworks reflected in his grey eyes, giving them an almost supernatural glow. "I'm 55 years old, Lucy. I could be your father. I've lived more than half my life, while you're just beginning yours." "We've already talked about that." "Yes, but we've never talked about what really exists between us." The air seemed to stop. Below in the square, the music kept playing and people kept dancing, but for them the world had shrunk to that small space between two people. "And what exists between us?" Lucy asked, her voice barely audible. "That's what I need to know, because what I feel—" He paused, as if the words cost him physically. "What I feel goes beyond friendship or affection. Anthony, let me finish." He took her hand in his. "I've fallen in love with you, Lucy. I don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe that day in the church when I saw your courage. Maybe when you refused my help out of pride. Maybe when we argued and you pushed me out of your life. I only know that every day I spend away from you is an incomplete day." Tears began to flow from Lucy's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. "Me too," she whispered. "I've fallen in love with you too, but there are no buts. I've spent months trying to convince myself that this was gratitude or admiration or something else, but it isn't. It's love, and it terrifies me as much as it makes me happy." Anthony raised a hand and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. I don't want to scare you. I don't want to pressure you. If you need time. I've wasted too much time already, waiting for the wrong man, believing empty promises. I don't want to keep waiting." They looked at each other for an eternal instant. Then, slowly, Anthony tilted his head and kissed her. It was a soft kiss, almost reverent, as if she were something precious he feared breaking. When they separated, the fireworks were reaching their final crescendo, painting the sky with explosions of golden and silver light. "And now what?" Lucy asked. "Now," Anthony replied with a smile that transformed his face, "we truly begin." From the shadows of a nearby oak, Miss Grace watched the scene with tears of happiness running down her wrinkled cheeks. James beside her remained silent. "Aren't you going to say anything?" the elderly woman asked. James shook his head. "I don't think there's anything to say. My father seems genuinely happy." "Does that bother you?" "It used to. I don't know what I feel anymore." Grace placed a wrinkled hand on the young man's arm. "True love doesn't understand ages or conveniences, young man. It only understands souls that find each other." James looked at her with something like respect. "You're a wise woman, Miss Grace. I'm an old woman, which is the same thing but with more wrinkles." And both laughed, while the last fireworks faded into the Georgia night. The weeks that followed the confession at the Overlook were the most blissful Lucy had ever experienced. But happiness, like summer storms, sometimes comes preceded by a deceptive calm. It all started with an article in a New York newspaper. A gossip journalist had captured photographs of Anthony and Lucy walking together through the city's streets during one of her visits. The headline was "Sensationalist: The Tycoon and the Baker, True Love or Calculated Interest." The article speculated about the age difference, insinuated economic motivations on Lucy's part, and suggested that Anthony was being manipulated by an ambitious small-town girl. The words were poison distilled in ink, each phrase designed to hurt and sow doubts. Lucy found out about the article from the neighbors' glances, sharper than usual. When she finally got a copy of the newspaper, she read it in the solitude of her room, feeling each word tear away a piece of the peace she had worked so hard to build. "It's a lie," Anthony said when he arrived that afternoon. "It's all lies, and you know it." "I know, but others don't." "And what does it matter what others think?" "It matters because I have to live here, Anthony. I have to see these people every day, work with them, live with their whispers. Then we'll leave. We can live in New York, in Chicago, wherever you want. Run away, that's your solution? It's not running away, it's starting over." "But I don't want to start over," Lucy's voice broke. "I already started over once when Paul left me. I don't want to spend my life running from what people say." Anthony approached and took her hands. "Then we'll stay. We'll face the rumors together. And what if I can't? What if the weight of their stares is too much? You'll handle it, because you're the strongest woman I know." "I don't feel strong. I feel—" Tears flowed without control. "I feel like that abandoned bride at the altar, humiliated, judged, never enough." Anthony embraced her, and she cried against his chest as she hadn't cried in months. All the insecurities she thought she'd overcome emerged like buried demons, claiming their space in her mind. "Listen to me," he said, gently pulling her back to look into her eyes. "What you feel is valid. The pain of what you experienced doesn't disappear overnight. But you can't let it define who you are. And who am I? You're Lucy Montgomery, a woman who transforms flour and sugar into art, a woman who cares for her grandmother with infinite devotion, a woman who had the courage to refuse charity when she needed it because her dignity was worth more than money. That's who you are, not what some third-rate journalist says." Lucy looked at him through her tears. "Do you really see me that way? I see you exactly as you are, and I fall more in love every day." They stayed embraced for a long time, the outside world reduced to a distant murmur. When they finally separated, Lucy had made a decision. "I'm not going to hide." "What are you going to do?" "Tomorrow I'll open the bakery like every day. I'll serve customers with the same smile as always. And if anyone has something to say to my face, I'll listen. But I'm not going to give power to rumors by locking myself away." Anthony smiled with pride. "There's the woman I fell in love with." And so it was. The next day, Lucy opened the bakery at the usual time. The first customers entered with cautious expressions, perhaps expecting some dramatic reaction. But they only found a smiling young woman offering them her pastries with the same warmth as always. By noon, something had changed in the town's atmosphere. The glances were still there, but gestures of support were also beginning to emerge. A neighbor who left an extra tip. An old man who murmured, "Don't pay attention to those New York vultures." Children who came in to buy candy and innocently asked if it was true that Lucy was famous now. The storm hadn't completely passed, but Lucy had discovered something important. She could dance in the rain without drowning. January brought with it frosts that covered the fields with silver crystals and an unexpected visit that would change the course of several lives. James Warren arrived in Savannah without warning, with a small suitcase and an expression Lucy couldn't decipher. He appeared at the bakery door just as she was closing, fine drops of rain beginning to fall on his shoulders. "I need to talk to you," he said without preamble. "Come in, I'll make coffee." They sat at the small table by the window, the one from which you could see the square covered with a fine layer of mist. The silence between them was different from their first meeting, less hostile, more laden with things to say. "My father wants to ask you to marry him," James finally said. Lucy felt her heart skip a beat. "What?" "He told me yesterday. He has a ring that belonged to my grandmother. He wants to give it to you. But he hasn't said anything to me. Because he wanted my approval first. He's old-fashioned about some things." Lucy looked at him intently. "And what's your answer?" James took a while to respond. He stirred the coffee he hadn't tasted, staring at the dark surface as if it contained answers. "I came here months ago convinced you were a gold digger. I came ready to expose you, to protect my father from what I believed was an elaborate scheme. I remember. But these months, I've seen how you look at him. I've seen how you take care of your grandmother, how you work to exhaustion, how you refuse every gift he tries to give you. And I've had to admit something that was hard to accept." "What?" "That my father deserves to be happy, and that you, for reasons I still don't fully understand, make him happy like I haven't seen in years." Lucy felt her eyes fill with tears. "James, I'm not done yet." He raised a hand. "I've also had to face some truths about myself. I blamed my father for my mother's abandonment for 5 years. 5 years of silences, of accusations, of keeping him at a distance, and all because I didn't want to accept that she simply stopped loving us. That wasn't anyone's fault. I know, now I know. But pain needs someone to blame, and my father was the easiest target." James finally took a sip of coffee, making a face at the cold. "I've talked to him, really talked, for the first time in years. I asked him to forgive me for how I treated him. And he hugged me, like when I was a kid and fell off my bike." James's voice broke slightly, and I realized how much I had missed him. Lucy extended her hand and placed it on his. "I'm glad you were able to reconnect. You're part of the reason. Before meeting you, my father was a shadow, a man who existed but didn't live. With you, he's become who he was before my mother destroyed him. He saved me first. Maybe you saved each other." The silence that followed was warm, complicit. "So," Lucy finally said, "do you have something to tell me about that ring?" James smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his severe face. "That my grandmother would have been delighted to know who's wearing it. She was a woman who valued courage above all else, and you, Lucy Montgomery, have courage to spare. Is that a yes?" "That's a welcome to the family." And on that January afternoon, as the rain kept falling softly over Savannah, 2 people who had started as adversaries sealed a peace that would last forever. February arrived with the news that Paul had returned to town. Lucy found out from Claire, the nurse who continued caring for Miss Grace and had become a close friend. Apparently, Paul had returned to live with his parents after his gambling debts caught up with him in Charleston, forcing him to flee from creditors less patient than those in Savannah. "You don't have to see him if you don't want to," Anthony said when she told him. "We can avoid the places he frequents. I'm not going to reorganize my life around Paul Mitchell. I already gave him too much power over me." But when they finally crossed paths a week later at the farmer's market, Lucy felt all her certainties waver for an instant. Paul looked worse than last time, thinner with pronounced dark circles and an expression of defeat that contrasted with the arrogance she remembered. When he saw her, something lit up in his eyes, a mixture of shame and a flash of something darker. Lucy. Paul. They looked at each other for an eternal instant. Around them, neighbors pretended not to observe while catching every detail of the encounter. "I heard you're getting married," he said. "Possibly. To the old millionaire? To Anthony?" "Yes." Paul let out a bitter laugh. Who would have thought? Sweet Lucy ended up being smarter than all of us. "I don't know what you mean by that. Come on, don't play innocent. You found a gold mine and exploited it. Well played." Lucy felt anger rise in her throat, but she contained it. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. "Think what you want, Paul. Your opinion stopped mattering to me a long time ago." "Really? Because there was a time when my opinion was the only thing that mattered to you. I remember how you used to look at me, like I was the sun. How you bent over backwards to please me. I was young and naive. I'm neither of those things anymore." "No. Now you're a millionaire's fiancé. Much better, right?" Lucy took a step toward him, and something in her expression made Paul instinctively step back. "I'm going to tell you something I should have said a long time ago. The day you left me at the altar, I thought my life was over. I thought I would never be happy again, that no one would love me, that I would always be the abandoned girl." "Lucy, shut up and listen." Her voice was firm as steel. "But what you did, as cruel as it was, turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to me. Because it freed me from you, from your lies, from your cowardice, from your selfishness. It forced me to discover who I really am, without depending on anyone's approval." Paul watched her with a confused expression. "And now I look back and the only thing I feel is pity. Pity for the man you could have been and never will be. Pity for the opportunities you wasted. But above all, pity for you, because while I've found happiness, you're still trapped in your own miseries." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the market vendors had stopped shouting their offers. "I wish you the best, Paul," Lucy concluded, turning around. "I really do. But your path and mine separated a long time ago, and there's nothing that can change that." And she walked among the market stalls, with her head held high, feeling that a weight she had been carrying for almost a year finally dissipated. That night, when she told Anthony what had happened, he hugged her tightly. "I'm proud of you for confronting him. For not needing to confront him to know who you are. That was just the confirmation of something you already knew." Lucy smiled against his chest. "I love you, Anthony, and I love you, more than words can express." Spring arrived in Savannah with its explosion of wildflowers and the song of mockingbirds at dawn. A year had passed since that failed wedding that had changed the destiny of so many lives, and the town was preparing for another very different celebration. Anthony had chosen sunset for his proposal, that magical moment when the sun transformed the oaks into golden silhouettes and the sky was tinted with all the colors of the rainbow. Lucy knew it was going to happen. James had let her know ahead of time, and the secret preparations Anthony thought he was hiding weren't as secret as he believed. But that didn't diminish the emotion when he led her to the overlook by the river, that same place where they had confessed their love months ago. "Lucy," Anthony began, his voice trembling slightly, "I've rehearsed these words 1,000 times, but now that I'm here, in front of you, they all escape me." "Then don't say anything," she replied with a smile. "Just show me." Anthony took from his pocket a small box of dark blue velvet. When he opened it, an antique gold ring shone under the sunset light. A solitaire diamond, surrounded by small sapphires that sparkled like tiny stars. "This ring belonged to my grandmother. She received it from her husband after 50 years of marriage, as a symbol of a love that never faded. When she died, she left it to me with a letter that said, 'Keep it for someone who deserves as much love as I received.'" Lucy felt tears begin to flow. "For years I thought I would never find that person. After the divorce I was convinced that true love was a myth, something that only existed in novels. But then I walked into a small church in Savannah, looking for refuge from the heat, and I saw a young woman in a wedding dress crying at the altar, and something inside me changed forever." He knelt before her, holding the ring like an offering. "Lucy Grace Montgomery, would you grant me the honor of becoming my wife?" She knelt before him, taking his face in her hands. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The kiss that followed was sealed by the last ray of sun sinking behind the oaks, and when he slid the ring onto her finger, they both knew that moment would be engraved in their memories forever. From the shadows of a nearby magnolia tree, Miss Grace watched the scene with tears of happiness running down her wrinkled cheeks. James, beside her, remained silent. "Do you think they'll be happy?" the young man asked. "I think," the elderly woman replied, "they already are. Everything else is just time." And as the first stars began to appear in the Georgia sky, 4 people whom destiny had united in the most unexpected ways toasted to love, to second chances, and to the courage to keep believing when all seemed lost. True love doesn't consist of finding someone perfect, but of learning to see someone imperfect perfectly. The bells of the small church in Savannah rang with joy under the midday sun of a September day. The scent of magnolias, the same that had filled that space 2 years before, once again floated in the air, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. Lucy walked down the aisle arm in arm with her grandmother Grace, who had insisted on being the one to give her away. The dress was new, designed especially for the occasion by a designer from Atlanta, who had heard her story and offered to create it as a wedding gift. It was simple but elegant, ivory silk that gleamed with every movement. The bouquet she held wasn't white roses this time. They were magnolias and jasmine, wildflowers from the coast that she herself had gathered at dawn together with Claire and the friends she had recovered during that year of transformations. At the altar, Anthony waited with a smile that lit up his entire face. Beside him, James held the rings with an expression of serenity that spoke of healed wounds and rebuilt relationships. And in the church pews, instead of 200 guests with expressions of social obligation, there were only 50 people, genuine neighbors, true friends, the small family both had built from the ashes of their previous lives. When Lucy reached the altar, her eyes met Anthony's and everything else disappeared. "You look beautiful," he whispered. "And you're trembling," she replied with a mischievous smile. "With happiness." Father Benjamin, the same one who had witnessed the humiliation 2 years before, officiated the ceremony with words that seemed specially chosen for them. "Love," he said, "is not a feeling that arrives complete and perfect. It's a decision made every day, a commitment renewed with every dawn. Lucy and Anthony have shown that true love can arise from the most unexpected circumstances, that the deepest wounds can become sources of strength, and that it's never too late to find happiness." When the moment for the vows arrived, Lucy spoke first. "Anthony, 2 years ago I walked into this church believing I knew what love was. I was wrong. Love isn't what Paul made me feel. Love is what you've taught me. Patience when I'm impatient, strength when I feel weak, faith when I doubt everything. I promise to love you not despite our differences, but because of them. I promise to build with you a home where laughter is more frequent than tears, where silences are comfortable and words are always honest. I promise to be your companion, your confidant, your friend, and your wife, all the days we have left to live." Anthony took her hands, and his voice, usually so controlled, trembled with emotion. "Lucy, life had convinced me that love was a thing of the past, a memory I kept in a locked drawer. But you opened that drawer and let the light in. You've taught me that age is just a number, that the past doesn't define the future, and that the heart can beat again with the same intensity as youth. I promise to protect you without smothering you, to support you without imposing, to love you without conditions. I promise that every day of our life together will be a new beginning, a new opportunity to show you how much you mean to me." When Father Benjamin declared them husband and wife, spontaneous applause filled the church, but Lucy barely heard it. She was too busy kissing her husband, sealing a love that had been born from the ashes of a public humiliation and had flourished into something stronger than any obstacle. The celebration that followed was in the town square, under the stars and the string lights the neighbors had hung as an offering of welcome. There was jazz and country music, barbecue and sweet tea, laughter and hugs that lasted well into the early morning. But the most emotional moment came when Miss Grace took the microphone with trembling hands. 2 years ago, she began, her voice surprisingly firm, I saw my granddaughter devastated in this very square. I thought the pain would consume her, that she would never smile with her heart again. But I was wrong, because Lucy is stronger than anyone, not even she herself knew, and because life, when we least expect it, sends us angels disguised as strangers. She looked at Anthony with bright eyes. Mr. Anthony, you appeared at the worst moment of our lives and turned it into the best, not with money, although your generosity was immense. You did it with something much more valuable, respect, patience, and a love that grew without haste but without pause. Thank you for giving me back my granddaughter. Thank you for becoming the son I never had. And thank you for showing the world that true love has no age, has no form, has no rules. It only has courage. The applause that followed was deafening. Lucy hugged her grandmother tightly, feeling in that embrace the entire history of her family, all the generations of strong women who had preceded her. Later, when the party was beginning to wind down and guests were returning to their homes, Lucy and Anthony walked to the overlook by the river, the same place where they had confessed their love, where he had proposed marriage, where so many crucial moments of their story had taken place. What are you thinking about? He asked, wrapping his arms around her. About how strange destiny is. If Paul hadn't left me at the altar, I would never have met you. If your driver hadn't taken the wrong turn, you never would have walked into that church. So many coincidences that had to align for us to be here. Do you still believe coincidences don't exist? Lucy smiled, remembering her grandmother's phrase that she had repeated the day they met. I believe some things are written, and I believe we were written for each other long before we met. Anthony kissed her forehead tenderly. So, Mrs. Warren, what does the future hold? I don't know, and for the first time in my life, that doesn't scare me, because I know you'll be by my side, whatever happens. They stayed like that, embraced under the stars, while the night breeze brought the scent of magnolias and the distant echo of a guitar playing an old love song. Below, in the now empty square, Miss Grace was picking up the last remnants of the party with the help of Claire and James. When she looked up toward the overlook, she saw the silhouettes of her granddaughter and her new grandson outlined against the starry sky. Finally, she whispered to herself, as she had done a year before, my girl found her way. And somewhere in the Georgia sky, the stars seemed to shine brighter, as if the universe itself were celebrating the triumph of love over pain, of hope over despair, of light over darkness. Because in the end, all true love stories end the same way, not with a happy ending, but with a new beginning. And this was just the start.